Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you're a returning listener, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, welcome. It's great to have you on board. So without further ado, let's get started on today's story. Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is presented by GoLoud, Ireland's leading audio publisher and the home of Irish podcasts. Find new episodes on the podcast first on the GoLoud app and on your favourite podcast platform. In late May 1996, a construction worker in Dublin made a grim discovery beside a skip in Glasnevin. It was the body of a young mother. Her name was Patricia Murphy, ní Bícheann. She was just 33 years old, with 4 children and close ties to her family back in County Clare. What followed was one of the most difficult cases the courts would hear that year. This is her story. Patricia Bícheann was born in London in October of 1962. Her arrival should have marked the beginning of a hopeful chapter for her parents, but life quickly took a different turn. Patricia's father walked out not long after her birth, leaving her mother Bridget, known to everyone as Biddy, to raise the baby alone. Biddy was already in her 40s at the time, and the sudden responsibility of single parenthood in a foreign city weighed very heavily on her. She needed the support of family, and so, before long, she packed up her life in London and returned to her home turf in Kilrush, County Clare. Back in Clare, Biddy and Patricia moved in with Biddy's brother Kevin, sharing a modest terraced house in the heart of the town. Patricia grew up in that small household, watched very closely over by her mother, who remained her closest confidant throughout her life. The years that followed were not easy financially, but Patricia was never short on love or encouragement. As a child, Patricia was educated at the local convent of Mercy School. She was bright, well-liked, and had a natural warmth that drew people to her. When she left school, she went straight into work to help contribute to the household. Her first job was at a local ice cream factory, a busy environment that taught her the value of long shifts and hard work. Later, she moved into hospitality, taking on waitressing shifts in a nearby hotel. These roles suited her, as she was friendly, approachable, and she enjoyed meeting people. Now, Patricia didn't want to stray too far from her mother in Kilrush. She felt a strong sense of loyalty to Biddy, who had given up so much for her, and for that reason alone, she resisted any pull to leave Clare for bigger opportunities elsewhere. She was happy being close to home, in the familiar surroundings of her own hometown. Coming of age in the 1980s, Patricia also had a love of music and dance. Kilkee, a seaside town just a short bus ride away, was the place to go on Saturday nights. The Atlantic Hotel in Kilkee was well known for its lively discos and weekend dances, and Patricia often travelled the 8 miles by bus with her friends to join the fun. These nights were full of energy, with young people from across Clare flocking there. Patricia, with her easy smile and natural charm, fitted right in. It was during one of those nights at the Atlantic that Patricia first encountered a man named David Murphy. He was a young Dubliner who was born in 1961. He'd come down to Clare with a company called Power Signs to install lighting for the hotel disco. When the job was finished, David didn't return to Dublin straight away. He didn't return at all, actually. Instead, he lingered in Kilkee, taking up a role as a handyman at the Atlantic Hotel. As a dub in the seaside town, David stood out. He had a different air about him. He was sharper, flashier, I suppose, for the time. And he had a taste for nice cars and stylish clothes, and he liked to be noticed, basically. That flair, along with his smile, caught the eye of more than one girl in Kilkee. But behind the facade, David had a secret of his own. He had grown up in Phibsborough on the north side of Dublin, in a household marked with strain, you could say. By the time he was 18, his own father had thrown him out of the family home after his gambling habit spiralled out of control. Slot machines were his weakness, the flashing lights, the lure of a quick win. He had been described even back then as a compulsive gambler, a habit that would never truly leave him. He had tried to build up a career. He trained as an apprenticed electrician, but he never finished the qualification. Work would come sporadically, and he developed a reputation for leaving jobs half done. Along with his gambling habit, David had other issues too. In his teenage years, he had what you'd call, I suppose, a volatile streak. Trouble seemed to follow him, and he was no stranger to the wrong kind of attention. By the time he arrived in Clare, however, David appeared to be looking for a new start. He was in his early 20s, he was away from home and seemed keen to carve out something new for himself in Kilkee. Working at the Atlantic Hotel gave him a chance to mix with the locals, though those who knew him later said he never fully blended in. He kept mostly to himself, doing odd jobs, and he kind of remained something of an outsider. But he was polite, and he could be charming when he wanted to be as well. For Patricia, who was then in her 20s as well, David was different from the young men she had grown up with. His Dublin edge, his confidence and his way of talking all carried, I suppose, a bit of a novelty, and it set him apart from the local boys. It wasn't long before their paths, as I said, crossed, and they began to spend more time together. What started as casual encounters soon grew into something more serious. Patricia's friends noticed the shift, and so did her family. David's presence in her life became more regular, and the two were increasingly seen as a couple. For Biddy, though, there was early warning signs. She didn't take to David the way Patricia did, and her reservations would only deepen as the time went on. But in those first months, Patricia was smitten. She saw someone exciting, someone who made her feel special. Coming from a small town in Clare, the attentions of a city boy might have felt like a breath of fresh air. Whatever doubt others had, Patricia seemed determined to give the relationship a chance. As the relationship with David developed, the people closest to her began to worry. From the outside, David presented himself well, but underneath, there were already troubling signs that set him apart from the kind of partner Biddy Bean had hoped her daughter might choose. One of the first red flags came from David's past. Before ever meeting Patricia, he had allegedly fathered a child with a local teenage girl. Instead of stepping up to take responsibility, he refused to support the mother or baby. For Patricia's family, who valued loyalty and responsibility, this was a stain that was hard to ignore. To Biddy especially, it spoke volumes about the type of man David might turn out to be. There were other concerns too. David's gambling, of course, was no secret. In Kilkee, he spent hours at the slot machines in the seaside arcades, feeding coins into the machines with compulsive energy. This didn't go unnoticed by the locals in the small little Clare town. Added to that, he was reckless with money. Shops and businesses in the town began to grumble that David was running up unpaid bills, leaving debts behind him. All this, of course, caused tension between Patricia's family and her new partner. Biddy, who had struggled for years to raise her daughter on her own, found it almost impossible to warm to David. She saw his flaws clearly, the debts, the gambling, the irresponsibility, and feared what they might mean for Patricia's future. Her dislike for him was no secret, and she did little to hide it. Yet Patricia remained undeterred. To her, David was still the man who had caught her attention at the Atlantic Hotel, someone who made her feel seen in a way that no one else had. Against the doubts of her family, she pressed on with the relationship. Within 8 months of their first meeting, Patricia and David made the decision to marry. On the 22nd of May 1987, they tied the knot. It was a modest wedding, stripped of any grandeur or large gatherings. The guest list told its own story. None of David's friends attended. His best man, in actual fact, was a friend of Patricia's rather than somebody from his own side. This imbalance was striking, but it didn't seem to trouble Patricia. As I said, the ceremony itself was a simple affair. Patricia wore a wedding dress that her mother had got for her. Biddy, I suppose, was willing to support her even if she disapproved of the match. With her blonde hair curled, Patricia looked every bit the young bride, ready to begin a new chapter. David, tall and lean, stood beside her in a dress suit. At the time of their marriage, the couple were living together in a small flat in the town square. It was a modest start, but for Patricia, who had grown up with little, it may have felt like, I suppose, the beginning of building her new life on her own. Not long after, they moved into a council house that backed onto Biddy's own cottage. The physical closeness meant that Patricia and her mother remained tightly connected, something that would prove both a comfort and a source of strain in the years that followed. Biddy was close enough to see and hear the daily realities of their life, and before long, cracks began to show. In the early months of the marriage, David worked as a kitchen fitter and electrician in the local area. On paper, it seemed like he was finally settling into responsibility, providing for his wife and building this stability. But beneath the surface, the same habits resurfaced. He was unreliable with jobs, often taking on work that he couldn't finish or underquoting so badly that the cost of materials exceeded what he had agreed to. Money slipped through his fingers, much of it lost to the slot machines he still couldn't resist. Despite the financial struggles, the young couple soon began to grow their family. Their first child, a daughter, was born in April 1988, less than a year after the wedding. For Patricia, becoming a mother was a source of great joy. She poured herself into caring for her baby, determined to provide the love and stability she herself had grown up with from her mother. But alongside the happiness of motherhood came growing tensions in the household. The marriage was already shown, as I said, signs of strain. Arguments became common, and Biddy, living just next door, often overheard the rows through the walls. Friends too began to notice signs that all was not well. At social gatherings, David's temper sometimes came out. One incident at a birthday party really stood out. He was seen grabbing Patricia by the throat in front of others. On another occasion, in the dining room of the Atlantic Hotel, shouting between them grew so heated that a friend intervened, only to find Patricia crying, backing away from David as he advanced with a knife in his hand. These were, I suppose, what you could say were glimpses of a darker reality that were behind closed doors, usually. To the outside world, however, Patricia often maintained the image of a loyal wife, committed to making her marriage work. Even close friends admitted that they only knew fragments of what was happening at home. But Patricia did confide in some that she did feel trapped, telling one friend that David had threatened to take the children if she ever left him. For a young mother with little financial independence, the fear of losing her children weighed heavily on her. The birth of their first child had not softened David's gambling or his recklessness with money. If anything, the pressures of fatherhood seemed to amplify his flaws. Patricia sometimes hid money from him, knowing that if he found it, it would vanish into a slot machine. By the turn of the 1990s, the strain was impossible to ignore. Patricia and David's marriage was built on fragile ground, to say the very least. And though she tried her best to hold things together, the cracks were only widening. Despite that, she adored her baby girl, and the bond between them was equally as close as that she had shared with her own mother. Biddy remained a constant presence, living next door, which meant she was there whenever Patricia needed her. As the time went on, friends noticed the toll it was taking. When they asked her why she didn't just leave, Patricia confided that David had threatened to take the children, and she feared that if she walked away, she would never see them again. That fear kept her trapped in a cycle of violence and then reconciliation. Despite this growing strain, Patricia continued to try and make the marriage work. 2 more children followed, a son in 1991 and another boy a few years later. By then, the pressure inside the marriage was unbearable. I'm sure even the children themselves probably witnessed several rows. Money, of course, was a constant source of tension. Patricia began hiding money from David, knowing that if she didn't, he would spend it all on the slot machines and other needless things. David's approach to work was equally reckless. He took on jobs he couldn't finish and hadn't costed properly, leaving Patricia to face the fallout with neighbours and friends when bills went unpaid or materials cost more than expected. It was humiliating for her, living in a small town where everyone knew everybody else. There was one occasion Patricia told her friends about that summed up her life with David, really. She said she, David and the children had gone to the beach in Kilkee. David told her he was just popping off to get ice cream, and hours went by and he still hadn't returned. When Patricia gathered up the children and searched the town for him, she found him sitting in one of the arcades, absorbed in the slot machines. His gambling habit became so destructive that he persuaded Patricia to take out a loan from the credit union, claiming it was needed for a deposit on a house. Once the loan, which was £2,000, was cashed, he blew the lot on a car instead. Even the credit union manager, who often checked in to ask Patricia how the new house was going, was unaware that the supposed home David spoke of was nothing more than a small house with her children underfoot and debts piling up. Patricia would tell people wryly, "If only he knew my house was on wheels." Patricia was juggling not only David's outbursts in gambling, but also the shame of all these mounting debts. She sometimes refused to even answer the front door, worried it would be another creditor chasing payment. Then, in the middle of all this turmoil, Patricia was dealt a devastating blow. After the birth of her third child, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. It was a very frightening diagnosis, obviously, but Patricia faced it with courage. She underwent treatment in Galway and, thankfully, in time recovered. Doctors reassured her that she would still be able to have more children. Her resilience shone through in this period, though the marriage just continued to fall down around her. By September of 1994, the family made a big move. They left Clare behind. Patricia, David and the children relocated to Glasnevin in Dublin. David believed there would be better work prospects for him in the capital. Patricia, however, was reluctant to go. She missed her mother deeply and would have preferred to stay in Kilrush. But once again, David had the final say, threatening to take the children without her if she refused. In the end, Patricia relented and went with him. But she told him plainly, if she was still unhappy after a year, they would move back. But the fresh start in Dublin did show promise at first. David found work as a self-employed electrician and carpenter. But soon enough, the same old patterns returned. He left jobs unfinished, became known for his unreliability, and his reputation, well, it quickly soured. Money troubles began to reappear, worsened by his gambling. Patricia continued to hide what she could to make sure there was enough money for rent and for food. In early 1996, Patricia gave birth to her fourth child, another daughter. By then, money was tighter than ever. David was losing as much as £200 a week on poker machines. The financial strain only grew, and Patricia began to talk about moving back to Clare. She missed her mother terribly and longed for the familiarity of Kilrush. She'd even applied for social housing there, hoping she and the children could start over. But David refused. He wanted to stay in Dublin, and Patricia, heavily pregnant at the time and then nursing a newborn, had little power to force the issue. Life in Dublin continued to deteriorate. Neighbours knew of David's debts. Patricia endured the humiliation again of the knocking of the door for people her husband had left unpaid. She did her best to put on a brave face, but her situation was becoming desperate. By this stage, the marriage was no longer, I suppose you could say, even just strained. It was collapsing under the weight of violence towards her, financial ruin, and emotional abuse. Patricia, who was determined to provide for her children, began to look for work again. She hoped that any income she earned could give her and her children some modicum of security. Since, obviously she could no longer rely on her husband. Not that she ever really could. One example being in early May 1996, David's gambling reached a new low. Patricia's mother, Biddy, had sent a £150 money order from Kilrush Post Office to help cover the cost of her granddaughter's first Holy Communion. Instead of passing the money on, David intercepted it and cashed it in and blew it on, you guessed, slot machines. This left Patricia scrambling to cover the shortfall. This was a turning point for Patricia. She could no longer trust her husband for even the most basic financial support. So, as I said, she went about finding a job so she could be financially independent. It was a very brave move for Patricia. She went on to find employment as a waitress in Lismore House B&B. This was just 15 minutes walk from her rented house on Griffith Avenue in Drumcondra. The job was modest, but it meant steady wages and, perhaps more importantly, a little bit of independence for Patricia. For the first time in years, she was earning money that David couldn't immediately squander. Even small amounts helped keep the household going. Food for the children, clothes for the children, and everyday things they needed. Friends later remembered how determined Patricia was to hold everything together, even if it meant working long hours on top of caring for her young family. By late May, Patricia's resilience was being tested even harder. She was balancing the work, the 4 children, and the strain of living with David, who was becoming more unpredictable. Neighbours and relatives later described him as a man consumed by gambling, slipping further into lies and excuses for ever chasing a quick win that never came. On the morning of Monday, the 27th of May, Patricia set off for work as usual at Lismore House. Geraldine Lynch, who worked as a housekeeper at the B&B and had become friendly with Patricia, later told Gardaí that she remembered Patricia serving breakfast to guests that morning. She seemed in good spirits when she left, and she walked home at around 10:30 a.m. That would be the last confirmed sighting of Patricia alive. By that evening, alarm bells began ringing. Patricia had not returned home as expected, and by the early hours of the next morning, David Murphy went to Whitehall Garda Station to report his wife missing. He told Gardaí Patricia had not come home after work and had been missing for, at this stage, between 14 and 15 hours. His manner was noted as oddly calm for a man whose wife had disappeared without explanation. Meanwhile, a construction worker heading to work early on Tuesday, the 28th of May, was walking through a laneway in Glasnevin known as the Rise, just 200 yards from Griffith Avenue. It would have been quiet at that hour. The streets were only beginning to start to stir. As he passed a skip and some discarded pallets, he spotted something on the ground. At first it looked like a bundle of clothes, but as he got closer he realised it was a woman's body, dressed only in underwear and lying in the fetal position against a wall. Shocked by what he'd just discovered, he quickly covered her with his jumper and called emergency services. The Gardaí arrived fairly quickly and cordoned off the area. The state pathologist, Dr. John Harbison, was called to the scene. Although the body had not yet been formally identified, Gardaí already suspected that it was Patricia Murphy. The missing persons report, the location so close to her home, and the circumstances all pointed in one direction. Later that morning, David Murphy was asked to formally identify the body. He confirmed that it was indeed Patricia. Their 4 children were told the devastating news that their mother would never be coming home again. At the scene, Gardaí made grim discoveries. Patricia's body had been placed on top of a piece of black bin liner. There were marks on her head and neck and a strap-like impression around her throat. The post-mortem confirmed she had died of asphyxia, a result of ligature strangulation. The injury suggested that a belt or a strap had been pulled tight around her neck, leaving behind a distinctive herringbone pattern. There were bruises on her chest and rib cage, as well as bleeding beneath her scalp, which pointed to a violent struggle. Yet despite her state of undress, there was no evidence of sexual assault. Forensic evidence suggested Patricia had been strangled elsewhere before being dumped in the laneway. Family and friends travelled from Clare to pay their respects. Patricia had been just 34 years old. For her children, I'm sure the loss was absolutely shattering, and for her mother, Biddy, it was a devastating blow to lose her only daughter. Meanwhile, Gardaí launched a murder investigation immediately. They appealed to the public for information, asking anyone who had seen Patricia after 10:30 a.m. on Monday, the 27th of May, to come forward. Locals were urged to check their gardens and bins for her missing clothes, which had not been found with her body. Witnesses recalled seeing Patricia wearing black ski pants, a black polo neck top, white walking shoes, and a blue and pink coat on the day she vanished. In those early days, suspicions began to circle back towards David Murphy. His story of reporting Patricia missing seemed carefully constructed, and there were questions about his movement on the 27th. Witnesses claimed they had seen him wheeling a buggy along Griffith Avenue on the day she disappeared, though Patricia was nowhere to be seen. That buggy was later found in the garage of their home with the tray missing. The discovery of Patricia's body so close to her own home made the crime feel more intimate and chilling. Whoever had killed her hadn't taken her far. It suggested that the person responsible was not a stranger, but someone maybe within her own household or immediate circle. The quiet laneway at the Rise was transformed into a crime scene, cordoned off with tape, while detectives began the painstaking process of gathering evidence. Dr. John Harbison had carried out the post-mortem. As I said, his findings were what were already suspected, that she had been strangled. Gardaí quickly began piecing together Patricia's final hours. They established that she had been seen at Lismore B&B on the morning of Monday the 27th, serving those breakfasts to the guests before leaving at around 10:30. From there, her movements were unaccounted for until her body was discovered the next morning. Circling back to that buggy that was found in their garage that had the tray missing, Gardaí began to suspect that this might have been used to transport Patricia's body. Meanwhile, Biddy, who was devastated by Patricia's death, spoke candidly to Gardaí about their daughter's life with David. She told officers about the rows, the violence, the gambling and the constant threats Patricia endured. She also revealed Patricia's growing determination in recent months to leave Dublin and return to Kilrush with her children. For detectives, the picture was becoming very clear. This was not a woman who would have disappeared voluntarily. Financial records and interviews with acquaintances painted David in a still darker light. He was deeply in debt, gambling heavily on poker machines, and had squandered not just his own earnings but also Patricia's hidden savings. There was the stolen £150 communion money sent by Biddy and blown by David within hours. That became a damning detail. Neighbours confirmed that Patricia had been humiliated by his unreliability and had been forced to apologise for jobs he'd left unfinished and debts he'd left unpaid. Gardaí also examined David's behaviour in the immediate aftermath of the murder. Instead of appearing grief-stricken, he was described as defensive, more concerned with how he was perceived than with finding who had killed his wife. His account of events was riddled with gaps. He insisted Patricia had gone missing after leaving for work, but co-workers confirmed she had finished her shift as usual and left in good spirits. Detectives also learned that Patricia had been planning her escape. She'd applied for that social housing in Clare and confided to her family and friends that she wanted to move back with her children. This revelation strengthened the Garda's theory that David's motives were rooted in control. He could not bear the idea of Patricia leaving him and taking the children. Forensic analysis supported the suspicion that Patricia had been killed inside the family home before being dumped in the laneway. The presence of the bin liner beneath her body suggested a hurried attempt to conceal evidence, while the missing clothes pointed to someone trying to remove incriminating items. By midsummer 1996, the investigation had zeroed in almost exclusively on David Murphy. Gardaí built a case based on a combination of forensic findings, witness statements and his suspicious behaviour. In July, David was arrested for questioning. He denied any involvement in his wife's death, maintaining that Patricia had failed to return home and that he had no idea what happened to her. But Gardaí were unconvinced. They believed he had strangled Patricia inside their home, transported her body in a buggy and dumped her in the laneway under the cover of darkness. The circumstantial evidence was the buggy, the missing clothes, the gambling debts, and the accounts of domestic violence. They all pointed in one direction. David would eventually be charged with Patricia's murder. The case would go to trial, with the prosecution determined to to prove that he had killed his wife in a fit of rage and then attempted to cover it up. For Patricia's family, the charge brought some relief, but the road ahead would be long and painful. By the time David Murphy's case reached the Central Criminal Court in Dublin in 1998, the murder of Patricia Murphy had already gripped both Clare, Dublin and the rest of the country. The courtroom was packed from the opening day. Journalists filled the press benches while Patricia's family sat quietly, bracing themselves to hear her private struggles become part of the public record. The prosecution opened by setting out a timeline. Patricia had been seen alive on the morning of the 27th of May 1996, working her shift at Lismore House B&B. Here she had served the guests breakfast before leaving at around 10:30 a.m. The next morning, her body was found in a laneway just 200 yards from her home. The state pathologist, Dr. John Harbison, gave evidence of her injuries: ligature strangulation, bruising to her chest, bleeding under the scalp. A strap or a belt had been pulled tightly around her neck, leaving behind that distinctive herringbone impression. He told the jury that Patricia's death would have been neither quick nor painless. The prosecution argued that Patricia had been strangled in her own home before her body had been transported and dumped. Supporting this theory was the testimony of neighbours who said they saw David Murphy on the day of her disappearance pushing a buggy along Griffith Avenue. Crucially, Patricia wasn't with him. When Gardaí searched the house, they found the buggy in the garage, with the tray missing. Investigators believed it had been used, as I said, to move the body. Forensic evidence also pointed to an attempt at concealment. Patricia's body had been placed on a black bin liner, suggesting someone had tried to prevent fibres or fluids transferring from the house to the dump site. Her outer clothes were missing, other signs that the killer had attempted to remove incriminating evidence. The prosecution moved next to motive. They painted a picture of a marriage consumed by gambling, debt and abuse. Witnesses told the court how Patricia had been forced to hide money from her husband to feed her children, because David was losing over £200 a week on poker machines. Her humiliation at neighbours' doors, apologising for his unpaid jobs and debts, was described in painful detail. There was also evidence of domestic violence. Friends and family testified that Patricia had confided about rows, threats and assaults. Some had seen bruises. One of them recalled that incident where David had grabbed her by the throat at the party. Another remembered Patricia's fear that if she ever left him, David would take the children and she'd never see them again. Perhaps most powerfully, the jury heard about Patricia's growing determination to escape, about how she'd applied for that social housing in Clare, desperate to return to Kilrush and the safety of her mother. To the prosecution, this was the trigger. David, unwilling to lose control and enraged by her plans, had killed her to prevent her from leaving him. David Murphy obviously denied murdering his wife. His legal team argued that the case against him was circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses to the killing, no direct forensic evidence tying him to the ligature. They suggested Patricia may have been attacked by someone else after leaving work that morning. They also tried to cast doubt on the buggy evidence, questioning whether it could really have been used to carry a body without anybody noticing. The missing tray, they argued, was not conclusive proof of guilt. David himself gave evidence insisting he had no part in Patricia's death. He said she had not returned from work on the 27th and that he had gone to the Gardaí out of pure concern. His demeanour in court was described by reporters as calm but defensive, often focusing on explanations for his gambling and debts rather than on his wife's death. The testimony of Patricia's family and friends left a strong impression on the jury. Biddy spoke of her daughter's fears, her humiliation over the death and her desperate wish to come home to Clare. Neighbours described all these rows and the tension in the Murphy household. A co-worker from the B&B confirmed that Patricia had been cheerful and in good form on the morning she disappeared. This undercut any suggestion that she'd vanished voluntarily. Forensic experts were also clear. Dr. Harbison told the court that Patricia's injuries were consistent with a sustained, deliberate act of strangulation. It was not something that could have happened accidentally. After weeks of evidence, the jury retired to consider their verdict. The wait for Patricia's family, I'm sure, was agonising. But when the jury returned, their decision was absolutely firm. David Murphy was guilty of the murder of his wife, Patricia. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. In a packed courtroom, Biddy wept as she listened. Reporters later wrote that there was no sense of triumph, only grief. Patricia was gone and nothing was going to change that. But the verdict at least meant that the man who had caused her so much pain would not walk free. The trial left the public with a devastating picture of Patricia Murphy's life and death. She had been a devoted mother, doing everything she could to protect her 4 children, even as she faced abuse, death, and fear in her marriage. Her murder shone a light on domestic violence in Ireland at a time when such issues were still often hidden behind closed doors. Newspapers wrote in the aftermath about the broader lessons of the case. The dangers of compulsive gambling, the failure of a husband to provide, and the way women like Patricia were often trapped by fear of losing their children. For her family, the pain is lifelong. Biddy lost her only daughter, and her 4 children were left to grow up without their mother. Even in victory, the trial felt hollow, to say the least. Patricia's life had been brutally taken, and the verdict could never restore what had been lost. When the trial ended and David Murphy was led away to begin his life sentence, Patricia's family were left to face a very difficult kind of sentence. They had sat through every day of the proceedings, listened to every detail of her final hours, and watched her character torn apart by defence arguments. The guilty verdict brought justice, but it could never bring her back. For her mother Biddy, as I said, the loss was unbearable. Patricia had been her only daughter, the child she had raised alone after her own husband had walked out on her when Patricia was a baby. The two were exceptionally close, not only because of that bond, but because they had lived side by side for years in Kilrush. In the months after the trial, neighbours described how Biddy moved through life almost in a haze of grief. The house in Kilrush that had once been filled with Patricia's laughter and visits from the children felt unbearably empty. Patricia's 4 children bore the deepest scars. At the time of her death, they ranged from just a few months old to 8 years of age. Overnight, they had lost not only their mother, but also their sense of security. Their father was in prison for life, leaving them without either parent to guide them. In the aftermath, the children were placed in foster care. 3 of them were placed together with one family and the youngest with another. Carers did their best, I'm sure, to provide stability, but nothing could erase the trauma of what they had endured. For the rest of their lives, they would have to carry the weight of knowing how their mother died and who had taken her from them. For the wider communities of Dublin and Clare, they also, I'm sure, struggled to process what had happened. In Kilrush, where Patricia had grown up, there was a deep sympathy for Biddy and for the children. Locals spoke of Patricia as a bright, kind, hard-working woman who had done everything she could to build a life for her family despite impossible circumstances. The contrast between the devoted mother they remembered and the violent way her life ended struck a painful chord. As of 2025, I could not find any credible source confirming that David Murphy had ever been released, so I'm assuming he's still in prison. But I have to say, nearly 30 years on, Patricia Murphy's story still resonates. It shows us the human cost of domestic violence. Her murder was not the result of a single outburst, but of years of control, intimidation and unchecked behaviour that escalated until it ended in this tragedy. In that sense, Patricia's case has become part of a broader legacy, one that continues to inform how we talk about abuse and how we remember women and men who've lost their lives to it. Today, when Patricia's name is mentioned, it is often in the same breath as discussions about the progress Ireland has made in recognising domestic abuse and the gaps that still remain. Her murder was one of the many in the 1990s that forced the public to confront the hidden violence in homes across the country. Each retelling of her story ensures that she is not forgotten and her life is remembered for more than just the way it ended. So guys, that's it for today's episode of the Ireland Crimes and Mysteries podcast. Again, thanks for your listenership, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and hit that auto download so you never miss an episode. Until the next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. This podcast has been compiled from information gathered in the public sphere, like news articles, documentaries and open source material that can be found on the web. Everything in this podcast is alleged unless a conviction has taken place.